Hey everybody, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Jacob B. Lax's and Angela G. Mertig's The Perceived Masculinity of Meat, Development and Testing of a Measure Across Social Class and Gender. This is a very new article, and I like engaging in new stuff. At the same time, this is outside of my field of comfort in some ways because this is a sociology. And like much of the social sciences, there is this sort of, because I think social sciences in the main sometimes have this sense that they can't make statements unless they can attribute some kind of quantitative measurement for it. And so this article, as the title might suggest, is about taking this concept that is embedded in the culture, that there is in Western North American culture, maybe not unique to it, but at the very least certainly present in it, and one can potentially extrapolate it into different non-North American cultures. But this association of meat, and I think particularly red meat, with men, with masculinity. And then they seek to discover some kind of, or develop some kind of measurement for that, so there can be a scale. And I don't know. I'm not embedded and committed to the sociological enterprise, to the enterprise of the social sciences, that has that idea of a something must be quantifiable in order, or their data must be presented in that kind of way. I am quite content with the idea of qualitative data, with the idea of narrative data, with the idea of ethnographic data. And I sometimes get in disputes with some of my other folklorists who are committed in that area as well. I have some friends in Eastern Europe and Russia, and they like the data, they like the tables, they like the stats. And in that way, they feel that they're more able to say definitive statements. It's like, sure, fill your boots, not going to deny it. So there's a lot of this article that is good, interesting, but not necessarily the reason why I would have people read the article. What it does do is it provides this nice summary and problematizes this consideration. So there's sort of these three vectors. One has to do with the assumption that meat is associated with the masculine, particularly within contexts of hegemonic masculinity, where masculinity is presented as some ideal type, where masculinity is also understood as somehow being under threat. Under threat by what? I do not know. I can imagine. In fact, I can probably articulate because I understand how hegemonic masculinity works. But the idea of like, oh, traditional manhood is being overwrought, and that sort of weird persecution complex that people with intense privilege tend to have. Something is being taken from us when other peoples are being elevated, to equivalency. So, so there's that one matrix. There's that sort of male-female matrix. Then there is the class dynamic. That idea that this idea of meat being inherently a masculine thing is much more common among people of lower socioeconomic status. And then thirdly, that people who are manual workers will have that even more so. And so I think ultimately, and again, I'm not a statistician, I can't tell about the efficacy of the measurement. And the experiment itself is perhaps flawed as an exercise, not necessarily as a measurement, for the very reasons that they themselves give, that their sample base, which was largely comprised, I think over 90% of the respondents were women, and what's more, not simply 90% of women, but the large population were of the middle class, people who didn't define themselves as working class, people who didn't define themselves as manual laborers, and people who fundamentally might not wish to participate in the exercise of gendering of food, with the idea that they are sort of living in a post-gendered society. But that's for a statistician to sort of prove the efficacy of their experiment. And what is more, they are cleanly aware. So I'm interested in this article because of how it so neatly summarizes some things. The idea that, first of all, that masculinity and meat are sometimes coterminous with each other because of either because of the relationship to the animal, that by that meat and masculinity go hand in hand in part because of the vestiges of the hunt. That there is something about the blood, the violence, the physicality of pursuing, and therefore the kind of virtual animalistic idea of the hunting itself that is that correlates meat and masculinity. So one of the ideas is that the hunt is so elemental, that the hunt has to do with physicality, and the hunt is a demonstration of all of those qualities of hegemonic masculinity, including again, the emphasis on the physical, the emphasis on the almost primordial, the push away from cleanliness and pristineness that might be seen as non-masculine. Let's not call them feminine, but let's call them sort of like non-masculine attributes. In the same way that so much of the aspect of physical sports and hockey and football and contact sports are this play, this display, this performance of embodiment that is specifically against the work of the mind. I mean, it's not that it doesn't require skill or intelligence, but it is not like the mind that is clerical, and it is not the same kind of mind that is that is sort of the of the office worker and of the interior worker. Nor is it the physicality of physical labor, it is the physicality of the embodied being who is also displaying independence. The same rationale that hunting does become a hobby in the 20th century and 21st centuries, as you can read in the work of Simon Bronner and the idea of hunting as a tradition, long after it becomes a necessary part of, or necessary skill set of North American white urban and suburban people, it becomes a hobby that connects one to the past, but also is this performance of masculinity. So there's that element that's in place, and therefore meat. The second is this kind of magico quality about it, that the animal itself is muscle and blood and sinew. And so that kind of physicality, muscle, and particularly muscle and blood, or muscle and sinew, I guess, and to a certain extent blood, are attributes that the masculine body should have, and therefore by eating these things one starts to inhabit them. There is, again, that it really is a sort of a magico property, that if I consume this thing, I will be like this thing. So the thing that I eat is basically almost in a process of not simply in terms of contagious magic, that I am I'm in literal contact with the thing that's going to therefore have some kind of effect on me, but also in terms of homeopathic magic, in that if I eat the muscly thing, I will resemble the muscly thing. And so there's fundamentally a correlation between the animal and the man, and I say the man in terms of the masculine ideal in this hegemonic framework. So that those two are kind of correlated, and that's not a weird North American concept, or exclusively a white suburban North American concept. You see anthropological studies of food like Sobo's The Sweetness of Fat, where one eats things that are parallel to properties that one would like. So, you eat red foods. Red foods are good for the blood. White foods are good for milk, or generating breast milk and generating semen. So white foods are good for white fluids. Red foods are good for red fluids. Both of those are understood as vernacular understandings of health. So it's not that weird a prospect to make that connection between if I eat of flesh, then I will have this. And then there's the kind of the scientific aspect that's associated with it. And when I say scientific, I really mean a vernacular health belief system that is reified, that is supported by selective understanding of emergent sciences. So this is good because of this. We have an understanding that is supported by science that protein is good for X, Y, and Z. So proteinaceous things, and particularly meat, is therefore a health positive thing. And long after science says, maybe not too much red meat, we're like, no, it's still good because it's about protein. And we have government programs that help to reify this, I used reify, I think, twice, and I'm sorry, I'm in a reification sort of mood. But we have these programs like during the war, where the First and the Second World Wars, where there was rationing of red meat in order to provide for soldiers. There is less on the institutional level, but certainly on the familial level. There's often the case of the people who are hard at work, the working man, the hardworking people, they get like the larger cuts of meat and so on. And I'll just stick to this. And that helps to associate not simply that this kind of work, this honest work, this genuine, valuable work requires this genuine, valuable food, and other forms of work don't. And again, there's that sort of disparity between the forget the traditional labor. It's the idea of traditional labor. It's the idea of the traditional way that one ought to be expending one's energy in terms of contributing to both the immediate household and society as a whole. One uses one's body, and therefore one is rewarded in many ways with the most valuable, the rarest, the most expensive of the means of feeding oneself. And we see that echoed in today. We see that in terms of, you go to Cora's and they have the trucker's breakfast, or like they have the lumberjack breakfast. They have these foods that are breakfasts that are thick in and resplendent in meat, because that is the thing that you need if you are doing honest work. And it's a distinction. They don't necessarily have the accountant's breakfast at Cora's. They don't necessarily have the associate professor of folklore's breakfasts at the Irving Big Stop. They should. It would be delightful, and it would be everybody's favorite, and there would not be any cantaloupe anywhere nearby. I digress. So why do we associate these things? And it's clear that we do. And one of the reasons why I like talking about this is that Lucy Long, in her culinary tourism work, she discusses these sort of opposites that are often in place, because the opposite has to do with the sort of form of tourism. Culinary tourism will often be predicated on restaurants that are others, because tourism is, as we all know, the leisured experience of otherness, where one is, using John Urie's terms, casting the tourist gaze on things that are different from the everyday. And so you need to sort of, how does one measure, not quantifiably, but how does one indicate otherness? And Long has this wonderful list of various binaries that are in place. So like old-timey foods. One of them is opposite in terms of ethos. So, vegetarian, one might sort of vicariously experiment with things like vegetarian food. You might not be a vegetarian, but you might go to a vegetarian restaurant. So, so this is what it's like. And that is a form of tourism. One of the ones that she doesn't necessarily talk about in terms of these opposites, and I think she's right in that they're not culinary tourism enterprises insofar as you can sort of point to various restaurants that might do this. Because unlike sort of contemporary versus old-fashioned, and you can go and you can experience like a medieval type meal, and you can experience colonial food and so on. So you have that sort of difference in time. There's sometimes sort of generational differences, and she doesn't say that that's in place. And I think yes and no. That's around a little bit, and certainly not necessarily an industry of it, but we will sometimes go and gravitate towards like places that might specialize in like hipster restaurants or hipster places that might have like peanut butter and jelly. The idea is that, well, this is basically a food from childhood that one is re-experiencing in this way. And I know on the personal level, there's often this fascination that children have with adult foods, certainly with adult beverages, and they might be exposed to it, recognizing that it is a food that is not meant for them. If you remember what Wendy Welch talks about in terms of how coffee is a marker of adulthood, and it is something that is framed as not for kids. So kids sometimes can become vaguely fascinated with the idea of coffee, even if the taste is not going to be theirs. Certainly beer, certainly whiskey. You sort of see these things that are designated as adult foods, and you wonder what's going on. And at the very least, if you're not talking about adult foods, you can be talking about adult ways of eating. So hey kids, we are going to have a dinner party tonight, or a tea party. I mean, a tea party is a classic example of children playing at adulthood. So there's that generational thing. Maybe it doesn't really have a restaurant enterprise collective complex associated with it, or a tourism complex associated with it. And the other one is gender. And she says, gender isn't really a thing. In terms of, and she's right, I don't think they're like girl restaurants and boy restaurants, or men's restaurants and women's restaurants. Much. They're not framed as such, although certainly there are things like steakhouses. There are things like certain forms of cuisines that are associated by the worldview that they communicate, often like sort of Southwestern or Western style restaurant, like, American West or Canadian West style restaurants, that by implication, if not necessarily by direct expression, are masculine in the way that they are framed. And you can tell that often by the way the waitresses are dressed. And conversely, I think you see that in the realm of drink a lot. And so once you start talking about things like cosmopolitans and certain forms of cocktails, they're clearly gendered foods. But meat seems to be at the crux of it. And so often we think about meat and not simply its eating, but also its preparation, in that the cooking of certain foods are, or sometimes the general act of cooking. And this is changing, but this is still very much alive and present, despite the fact that it might be changing. Cooking in general, because it's associated with certain forms of women's labor, it's often seen as a non-masculine act. Except barbecue has always been an exception of that. One, it takes place outside as opposed to the sort of framed domestic kitchen. B, it typically involves much more elemental forms of preparation in terms of fire and steel and what the grill might suggest. And third, it typically involves meat. So that is attached to but removed from the home, that it is literally elemental in terms of fire, as opposed to like a hob or a range or something where fire is controlled. No, you want to see a flame spit out. And then third, that it's meat, that it is about an understanding or purported understanding of this elemental food stuff. All of that associates barbecue with masculinity. And so the article just nicely encapsulates some of what's going on. And as I said, it encapsulates the idea that these attitudes, if they're not necessarily disappearing, they might be attitudes that we don't really like having, and therefore our measurement system might needs to account for the fact that we will sometimes deny these cultural understandings that are not necessarily present. What's the terms they use? Yeah. Social desirability effects. By interspersing the measurement of meat items among these other items, it was hoped that the social desirability effects, and it is assumed people do not want to acknowledge gendering of food, would be lessened. I think about this the whole time, because as I try and raise my son in a post-gender age, and I was like, stop him. I will stop him. I will try and stop him before it has to be his mother stops him when he starts doing kind of like iffy gender generalizations. Like, no. And I'll catch him on that. It's part of the process. Nevertheless, there are like meat nights, and the meat nights are almost inherently framed as kind of a boys' night kind of thing. And so despite this fact despite this effort to not be gendering food, I find myself doing it, maybe in the realm of play, but the fact that it's in the realm of play does not necessarily mean that I am not perpetuating this idea. So it's an interesting thing. This is a short video because so much of the article is, again, sociological, and it's good. We should go outside. We should see what the social sciences people are doing, and bravo, this might be a useful tool for us. But I do like the idea of taking these things and really examining them. It's like, what is this? How does this item fit into my idea of gender? And the fact that we might have these associations does not make us bad people inherently. It's good to recognize that we are dealing with these constructs. It's good to recognize that we are still operating within them, perhaps on a subconscious basis. And we can continue to be participating in them, even when these things are pointed out to us, as long as we recognize we are participating in them because they are constructs and not participating in them because they are necessary, because this is the way things are, because of the way things have to be. But this is the way my culture plays, and the way my culture plays does this. And if we can sort of indicate that there isn't necessarily a severe harm, if women aren't being deprived of meat when they should be having it, if people aren't having meat forced upon them in order for them to be recognized as somehow masculine, if it's just a boys' night, time for steaks, what are the limits? Where do we distinguish these things? So anyway, it's a short article. It's a fine article. It's a recent article. It's always good to read the recent stuff. And it has been Jacob B. Lax and Angela G. Mertig's The Perceived Masculinity of Meat, Development and Testing of a Measure Across Social Class and Gender. Anyway, my friends, that's all for this evening. It's evening where I am. I don't know where it is where you are. But as ever, I wish you well. Be well, eat well, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.